Hey everybody, Desi Kuna here again with Outlier Strength and Conditioning, and the topic of today is the hip shift. What is it? How do we fix it? And do we even need to? Let's dive in. So a hip shift is a lateral movement of the pelvis away from midline in the frontal plane, usually talked about while squatting, although there are a couple of other movements where this might be apparent. And while a shift to either side is possible in my experience, some schools of thought like PRI will tell you that a rightward shift is far more common, and that's due simply to the inherent asymmetry of the human body. So the causes of a hip shift are almost always multifactorial. They might not be what you think they are. So just because someone is shifting to their right side doesn't mean that it's always a problem associated with something on their left. And it's important to consider a lot of different possibilities when developing a plan to tackle an asymmetrical squat. But before we talk about that, let's ask the most important question here. Do we even need to fix it? I would say that the answer to this question depends both on the severity of the case and the goals and the background of the client or athlete in question. It's sort of an inconvenient truth to this theory that almost everyone is going to experience some degree of asymmetry somewhere in their squat. And the overwhelming majority of people are never going to develop pain or symptoms associated with that. So no, in a lot of cases, I don't think that exhaustive efforts are warranted in trying to correct a hip shift. Now that being said, if a client comes to you with an extremely dominant and apparent hip shift that you feel poses either a risk of acute injury or chronic overuse injury to the muscles on one side of the body versus the other, then yeah, absolutely, it's worth putting time and effort into correcting that hip shift or simply eliminating or regressing from that squat pattern. Remember, if your client isn't a power lifter or a weightlifter, then they don't have to be barbell back squatting, and they definitely don't have to be barbell back squatting right now before you fix the problem. So now diving into some of the actual causes and fixes of a hip shift. Number one, and this one is a no-brainer, this is an easy one, look first to the feet, okay? A lot of people who experience asymmetry in their squat are actually just placing their feet unevenly. So first things first, make sure that the feet are aligned evenly, break out the painter's tape if you have to, but if you fix that, it's going to clear up the majority of problems right away without even having to put in any serious effort on that end. It's also worth noting here about the feet that sometimes the weight is distributed unevenly between the feet, so from left to right, and also within each foot. So for example, it's not uncommon for someone to be pressing extremely hard through their right heel and their left toe simultaneously, which would result in some shifting and twisting occurring, which could manifest in the form of a hip shift. So that's number one. Number two, make sure that you're taking a detailed injury history of your client before making assumptions. So while you're off chasing one theory that you have and you didn't know that your client has had 5 surgeries on their left leg, it's a safe bet to assume that subconsciously over the years, that client has become accustomed to shifting away from the pain associated on that side, and that can be the root cause of something that you're dealing with. So make sure that you're taking a detailed injury history. Number 3, with those first 2 things aside, the next thing you're going to want to look at is mobility. If your client doesn't have sufficient and also symmetrical mobility on both sides, and particularly here, we're talking about the ankle, but also at the hip. So not just dorsiflexion, but also hip flexion and extension, and internal and external rotation. If they don't have adequate mobility, that's the same or close on both sides, that's the next most low-hanging fruit that you should try to intervene at. So that's going to be the least amount of effort you can put in to make the biggest change. Number 4, look to stability next. And this is something I've talked extensively about, as have many others, but it's a fair bet to say that you have one leg that's far more stable than the other. This is going to show up in your bilateral squat movement. So for example, if you can just bang out 15 perfect single leg squats on your right leg, and you can't stand on your left leg for 15 seconds without falling over, it's safe to say that you have a discrepancy in the stability between your left and right legs, and that's something you want to address before loading heavily again under a barbell if you want to correct that hip shift. And number 5, lastly, look to strength, actual unilateral strength or force production. So it is common to have a dominant side or a dominant leg, and that's again something that can show up and cause a hip shift. So for example, if your left leg can just produce more force than your right leg, yeah, you would expect that to show up under heavy load when you're pushing maximally and recruiting everything that you can. So that's why it's important to include some form of unilateral training in any program. But this is sort of the last place I would check, and I would have exhausted the first 4 options because again, they take a lot less time, a lot less energy, and they're more often the culprit than an actual strength deficit between legs. Well, that's it, guys. I hope this video has been helpful. If you struggle with a hip shift or if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out or comment below and I will get back to you. And as always, please feel free to like and share this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.